The winter of 1888 was not born in the sky. It was born in the bones, a deep premonitory ache that settled in the joints of man and beast alike. It was a feeling whispered from the old lands, a folk memory of cold so profound it could crack stone and freeze the marrow. In the small, hopeful settlement of Providence, nestled in a high mountain valley, the people prepared as they always had. They prepared with the axe and the saw. They prepared with sweat and the satisfying thud of split logs tossed onto ever-growing pyres of fuel. They prepared with the certainty of their methods, the unshakable faith in the cast-iron stove and the thick-walled log cabin. Alara was 18 years old, and she had not prepared at all. Her parents had been taken by the summer fever, a swift and merciless reaping that had left her the sole occupant of a small, mortgaged cabin and the inheritor of a debt that felt as vast and insurmountable as the mountains looming over the valley. She was an orphan, a word that in a place like Providence meant she was a loose thread, a problem to be solved by the community's tightly woven fabric of pragmatism. The problem was solved in the town hall, a single large room that smelled of pine floorboards and self-importance. Mr. Abernathy, the land agent, a man whose spine seemed to be fused into a permanent posture of disapproval, laid out the papers on the table. Beside him sat Silas, the town's master builder, a man whose hands were as thick as timber and whose pronouncements were treated as gospel. "The debt stands at $200, Abernathy stated, not looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the inkwell, as if it held more interest than the young woman whose life he was dismantling. "The cabin and its 1-acre plot are valued at $150, the tools and livestock, another $30. It is not enough." Alara stood before them, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The numbers were as cold and hard as the coins she did not possess. Silas cleared his throat, a sound like rocks grinding together. "The cabin is well built, my own work. It will serve a new family well." He glanced at Alara, a flicker of something that might have been pity, but was more likely impatience. The girl, however, still possesses the secondary plot, the one her father bought in a moment of speculative fancy. A low chuckle moved through the assembled men. The secondary plot was a local joke. 5 acres of sheer rock, tangled woods, and steep grades 2 miles outside of town. It was land that fought the plow, land that broke shovels, land that was good for nothing but holding the rest of the world together. Her father had believed there might be silver in it. He had been wrong. "The plot is worthless," Abernathy sniffed. "It cannot be counted against the debt." "Then the debt remains," Silas concluded. He finally looked directly at Alara, his gaze heavy with the weight of communal decision. "The bank reclaims the cabin and the primary acre. It is the law. It is just." Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, the sounds of the room, the shuffling of papers, the cough of a man in the back, all faded into a dull roar. This was it, the moment her life fractured. "What am I to do?" The words were a whisper, barely audible. Abernathy shrugged, a small reptilian movement of his shoulders. "There is a place for you at the church dormitory, mending clothes, working in the kitchens, or you could find a family that needs a hired girl." The options hung in the air, each one a different kind of cage. Then Silas spoke again, a note of magnanimity in his voice that was sharper than any insult. "It is not our wish to see a child of this valley cast out with nothing. The winter is coming. A hard one, the old-timers say." He stroked his beard. "She may have the worthless plot. As a gesture of charity. She may winter there if she can. When the thaw comes, she can make her way to the city, or find work as she sees fit. We will not have it on our conscience that we threw her to the wolves on the eve of the first snow." The men nodded. It was a good solution. It was merciful. It absolved them. They were giving her a chance, a piece of land that was hers, free and clear, a piece of land that everyone in the room knew was a death sentence in winter. They were not kicking her out. They were giving her a place to die in private. "This is woman's folly," Silas would later say to his wife, his voice laced with the confident pity of a man who has never known true desperation. "She will last a week. Then she will come crawling back, begging for a corner in the church hall. Pride is a cold blanket. Alara did not crawl back. She walked out of the town hall, her back straight, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. She packed her mother's small trunk, a few clothes, a cast-iron pot, her father's last remaining shovel, and a tattered book of her grandmother's pressed flowers. She walked the 2 miles to the plot of land that was now her entire world, her inheritance of rock and ruin. The first night, she slept under a rocky overhang, wrapped in a single thin blanket, and cried until she had no tears left. The cold was not yet a predator, but it was a presence, a constant, seeping thing that found its way through her clothes and into her bones. The wind moving through the pines sounded like a lament. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. The next day, she began to explore her kingdom of stone. It was as unforgiving as its reputation. The ground was a thin layer of soil over rock, the trees were gnarled and stunted, and the inclines were treacherous. She saw no future here, only an end. She sat on a cold boulder, the shovel useless at her feet, and felt the last embers of hope begin to fade. It was then that she remembered her mother's trunk. In her grief and haste, she had just grabbed it. But now she thought of its contents, not just the clothes, but the things tucked in the bottom. Her mother had never thrown anything away that belonged to her mother, Grandmother Anya. With a last surge of energy, she returned to her meager camp and opened the trunk. Beneath the folded linens and a dress her mother had been married in, she found them. A small, velvet pouch of strange-smelling dried herbs, a set of wood-handled carving knives, and 3 leather-bound journals. The journals were filled with her grandmother's elegant looping script, a mix of the old country language she barely recognized and heavily accented phonetic English. Grandmother Anya had come from a land of ice and fire, a place where the earth itself was alive and breathing. She had been a strange woman in this valley of pragmatic farmers, always talking about the spirit of the mountain and the wisdom of the stone. People had dismissed her as a charming eccentric. Alara opened the first journal. The pages were filled with drawings of plants, geological formations, and strange diagrams of houses that looked more like burrows than buildings. She began to read, her finger tracing the faded ink. "The men here are fools," one entry began, the English sharp and clear. "They build their homes to fight the winter. They stand tall and proud on the land, and the wind, it laughs and strips their warmth away like a thief. They feed their iron gods wood, 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 until the forest weeps. They do not understand. You do not fight the winter. You ask the earth to hold you." Alara's breath caught in her throat. She kept reading. Anya wrote of zemlyankas, earth-breathing houses. She wrote of thermal mass, a concept Alara struggled with until she found a simple explanation. The stone drinks the sun's warmth all day and sips it all night. The earth keeps the memory of summer deep in its belly. A good house is a cup held to the earth's heart. Then she found the passage that would change everything. "Look for the signs. Where the winter refuses its throne, a place the snow will not touch, look for the moss that grows green in the cold months, a shade of impossible life. It is the color of the earth's warm blood. Follow the scent of summerstone on the winter wind, a smell like a blacksmith's forge after a rain. This is where the mountain exhales. This is where you make your home." A memory, faint and distant, sparked in Alara's mind. A walk with her father on this very land years ago. He had been cursing the rocky soil, and she, a small child, had pointed to a patch of strangely vibrant green moss growing on a sheer cliff face. "Look, Papa," she had said, "it's like summer lives there." He had just grunted and moved on. She slammed the journal shut. A wild, impossible hope surged through her. She began that very day. She grabbed the shovel, her father's last gift, and scrambled back through the woods, her eyes scanning not for arable land, but for rock. She found the cliff face from her memory, a 50-foot wall of dark granite, seemingly impenetrable. And there it was, a patch of moss 10 feet wide, a startling, vivid emerald against the gray stone. Even in the autumn chill, it was lush and healthy. When she placed her hand against the rock near the moss, she could feel it. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth. The journal had said to look for the scent. She sniffed the air, nothing but pine and damp earth. But then she pressed her nose close to a crack in the rock, right at the base of the mossy patch. There it was, a faint mineral tang, the smell of warm, wet stone, the smell of the earth's breath. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. You do not ask the stone to move. You ask it to let you in. The work was brutal. The ground at the base of the cliff was packed with rock and roots. The shovel, designed for soft soil, was a clumsy tool. The metal blade rang against hidden stones, sending jarring shocks up her arms. Her hands, soft and unused to such labor, were a mass of blisters by the end of the first day. By the end of the third, the blisters had broken, bled, and begun to form calluses. Her back screamed in protest. Her muscles burned with a fire that sleep could not quench. She was not just digging, she was excavating. Following the line of warmth, she cleared away a ton of rock and earth, revealing not a solid wall, but a collapse. A jumble of massive boulders and scree that had long ago sealed a natural opening in the cliff. It wasn't a cave entrance. It was the ghost of one. For 2 weeks she worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by stale biscuits and a growing, fierce determination. She used a thick branch as a lever, straining with every fiber of her being to shift rocks that seemed fused to the earth. She dug with her bare hands when the shovel couldn't fit. She was a creature of dirt and sweat, her hair matted, her face smudged with grime. She was creating a hole, a wound in the hillside. It was during the 3rd week that Silas and Abernathy rode by. They were inspecting timber stands, their horses picking their way delicately along the ridge above her plot. They stopped when they saw her, a small figure covered in mud, heaving rocks away from a cliff face. Abernathy snorted. What in God's name is she doing? Silas watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He saw the pile of displaced rock, the shallow pit she had dug. She is digging her own grave, he said, his voice flat. He raised his voice, letting it carry down the slope. Girl, what is this folly? Alara paused, her back to them. She did not turn around. She simply hefted another rock and tossed it onto the pile. The message was clear. It is a sad thing to see pride lead a soul to madness, Abernathy declared to the trees. Let her be, Silas said, turning his horse. The first deep snow will teach her the lesson she refuses to learn from us. They rode off, their laughter echoing faintly behind them. The word folly stuck. It became her name in the town's quiet gossip, the orphan girl's folly, a monument to stubborn pride. Alara ignored them. Their world of wood and iron and judgment was fading. Her world was stone and warmth and the whispers of her grandmother. A week later, after moving a particularly large boulder that took her 2 full days to lever aside, she broke through. A wave of warm, damp air washed over her face, thick with the smell of sulfur and minerals. It was like stepping into a bathhouse. She had found it. She peered into the darkness. It was not a large opening, just big enough to crawl through. With a deep breath, she lit a precious tallow candle and squeezed inside. The world changed. The autumn chill vanished, replaced by a profound, humid warmth. The air was thick and tasted of stone. The candlelight flickered against wet, glistening walls, revealing a narrow passageway that sloped gently downwards. And she could hear it, a soft, constant trickling. She followed the sound. The passageway opened into a small cavern, perhaps 20 feet across and high enough for her to stand. In the center, a pool of water steamed gently, fed by a steady trickle seeping from a fissure in the rock wall. A hot spring. Not a boiling geyser, but a gentle, constant source of heat, warming the water to the temperature of a hot bath. The water overflowed the pool and ran in a small stream across the cavern floor, disappearing into another crack on the far side. The air was almost too thick to breathe, the humidity so high that water beaded on her skin instantly. The walls were slick with moisture, and a fine mist hung in the air. It was a place of impossible warmth, but it was not a home. It was a steam room, a swamp. To live here as it was would be to invite sickness, rot, and misery. This, she knew, was where the real work began. The labor of brute force was over. Now came the labor of intellect, of engineering, of harnessing the power she had uncovered. She went back to the journals. Grandmother Anya had foreseen this. "The earth's breath can be a blessing or a curse," she wrote. "Too much warmth suffocates, too much water drowns. You must teach the cave how to breathe with you. It must have lungs, it must have veins. Lungs, ventilation." Alara studied the cavern ceiling. She held her candle up, watching the flame. It flickered wildly, dancing in unseen currents of air. She followed the drafts, feeling with her wet hand for the slightest movement. She found it near the highest point of the ceiling, a small vertical fissure, a crack leading upwards. It was the cave's natural exhaust, but it was too small, too constricted. For the next week, she performed the most terrifying work of her life. Using her father's shovel handle and a sharpened rock, she built a precarious scaffold of stones and began to painstakingly widen the fissure. She would chip away at the rock for hours, her arms aching, dust and debris raining down on her. Then she would climb down and use a bucket to haul water from the spring, flinging it upwards into the crack. The hot water, hitting the slightly cooler rock, caused it to fracture and splinter. It was a technique from the journals, under a chapter titled "Persuading the Stone." It was slow, dangerous work. A single misstep, a single larger-than-expected rockfall, and her folly would indeed become her tomb. Finally, after days of chipping and splashing, she broke through to the open air. A shaft of pale autumn light, no bigger than a dinner plate, pierced the cavern's gloom. A steady, gentle column of steam began to rise from the opening, carrying the excess humidity with it. She had given the cave a lung. The air immediately began to feel lighter, fresher. Next, the veins. The water on the floor was the biggest problem. It made everything damp and promoted mold. The journal was clear. Live above the water. Make the water your servant, not your master. She spent another 2 weeks transforming the cavern floor. Using flat stones she hauled in from outside, she built a raised platform on the side of the cavern farthest from the spring. It was a dry island, a foot above the dampness. This would be her living space. Then, she turned her attention to the spring itself. The natural pool was irregular, messy. With her shovel in her bare hands, she dug it out, deepening it, lining its edges with smooth, carefully placed stones, creating a perfect circular basin. It was a basin for bathing, for washing, for warmth. The overflow was the real challenge. The small stream cut right through the middle of the cavern. Using her remaining store of ingenuity, she began to carve a new channel. She used one of her grandmother's carving knives, a tool not meant for stone, to score a line in the cavern floor, a path she wanted the water to follow. Then, day after day, she trickled hot water along the line, followed by cold water she hauled in from a nearby creek. The thermal stress, repeated hundreds of times, created a shallow groove. She deepened it with chipping and scraping, a painstaking process that took another week. She carved a channel that hugged the cavern wall, directing the warm overflow from her neat new pool around the perimeter of the cave before it exited through the crack on the far side. Her dry platform was now completely safe from the water. The center of the cavern, once a muddy mess, was now dry, usable stone. But she wasn't done. The journal had one more chapter that intrigued her, a section on stomach and hearth. "The mountain's belly is hot," Anya wrote. "A wise woman does not bring fire into a warm house. She asks the house to cook for her." The diagrams showed a kind of oven built directly into the hot rock wall, a stone box that would capture and concentrate the geothermal heat. Alara identified the hottest part of the cavern wall, near where the spring emerged. The rock here was almost too hot to touch. Using clay, she had discovered digging the foundations of her living platform, a sticky, gray substance, and more flat stones she began to build. She constructed a small stone-lined cavity against the rock face, with a heavy, flat stone for a door. It was a crude, primitive oven, but it was built on a sound principle. The ambient heat from the rock would slowly, gently bake whatever was placed inside. By the time the first real snow fell, a light dusting that melted on contact with her warm hillside, Alara's home was complete. From the outside, it was almost invisible. Just a low, dark opening at the base of a cliff, shielded by a crude door she had fashioned from woven branches and mud. There was no smoke, no sign of life, save for the impossible patch of green moss and the faint wisp of steam rising from the hidden chimney high above. Inside, it was another world. The air was a stable, comfortable 70 degrees, warm and humid like a greenhouse. Her raised stone platform was covered with pine boughs, and her one blanket, a dry and comfortable bed. In one corner, herbs she had salvaged from her mother's garden grew in pots, thriving in the warmth and indirect light from the chimney. Her stone oven, after a few failed attempts, had produced a small, dense, but perfectly edible loaf of bread. The hot spring pool was a luxury beyond the dreams of kings. She was not just surviving, she was living. While Alara settled into her subterranean comfort, the Valley of Providence prepared for war. The whispers of a hard winter had become a roar. The first snows were heavier and earlier than anyone could remember. The temperature plummeted and the wind began to howl, a constant malevolent presence from the north. The settlers retreated into their log cabins, congratulating themselves on their foresight, their high stacks of firewood a bulwark against the cold. Then came the great freeze. It was not a storm. It was a siege. The sky cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue, and the temperature fell and fell and fell, and it dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. The old-timers, the ones who had spoken of a hard winter, fell silent. They had no memory, no story for this kind of cold. It was a living thing, an entity of pure frost that leached the heat from everything it touched. The log cabins, Silas's pride, began to fail. They were built for snow and wind, not for this deep, pervasive cold. The logs, thick as a man's thigh, seemed to radiate cold. The chinking between them, sealed tight in the autumn, shrank in the extreme temperatures, opening up 1,000 tiny cracks for the cold to infiltrate. Frost grew on the inside of the walls, a crystalline tracery of failure. The iron stoves, the heart of every home, became voracious gods. They had to be fed constantly, their appetites insatiable. A week's worth of wood, carefully corded and stacked, was gone in 2 days. The sound of axes, which had been the valley's autumn song, returned with a new, desperate urgency. But the trees were frozen solid, and the axe blades, brittle with cold, sometimes shattered on impact. Soon, the wood piles began to disappear. Panic, a more chilling intruder than the frost, began to creep into the valley. Families abandoned their larger rooms, huddling together in a single space around the ravenous stove, feeding it furniture, then floorboards, anything that would burn. Silas's house, the grandest in the valley, was no exception. It was a tomb of ice. His wife and 2 small children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedroom. The last of their firewood was gone. Silas had burned his workbench, the fence posts, the decorative shutters he had so proudly carved. Now there was nothing left. His youngest son was coughing, a dry, rasping sound that terrified him more than the howl of the wind. He sat in the frigid dark, his pride a heap of ashes. He had been so certain, so wise. He had built these houses. He had pronounced judgment, and he had been wrong, utterly, catastrophically wrong. His methods, the wisdom of his entire trade, had crumbled in the face of this elemental cold, and in the deepest, most desperate corner of his mind, a thought sparked, a memory of a girl covered in mud, a folly, an impossible warmth he had felt for a fleeting second on the wind that day. He had dismissed it as madness, but what if it wasn't? He looked at his shivering son. Desperation was a powerful corrosive, capable of dissolving even the most stubborn pride. He had to know. He had to go see. He told himself it was a fool's errand, a final act of madness. He expected to find a frozen corpse, a grim testament to his own prophetic words. Part of him, the dark, shamed part, almost hoped for it. It would prove he had been right in the end. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, he set out into the frozen hell of the great freeze. The cold was a physical blow. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, and his beard quickly became a mask of ice. The 2-mile walk to Alara's plot was an epic journey, a battle for every step. The snow was knee-deep, the wind a solid wall. Twice he fell, and it was only the image of his son's pale face that gave him the strength to get back up. He finally stumbled onto her land, exhausted, half-frozen, his hope dwindling to a single guttering flame. He looked towards the cliff face. There was no smoke. Of course there was no smoke. His heart sank. He had been a fool. He was too late. He had sent a girl to her death, and now he had come to stare at her grave. He staggered forward, driven by a grim need to see, to confirm the tragedy. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. The snow around the base of the cliff was thinner, and there, near a dark patch that might be an opening, there was no snow at all. The ground was bare. He saw the impossible patch of green moss, vibrant and alive against the ice-rimed rock. Then he smelled it. It was faint, almost lost in the frozen air, but it was unmistakable. He smelled damp earth. He smelled warm stone. He smelled— was it possible? He smelled baking bread. His frozen mind reeled. It was a hallucination, the final trick of a freezing brain. But the smell grew stronger as he stumbled closer to the low, dark opening, the one crudely covered by a woven door. A faint, golden light emanated from its edges. He fell to his knees before the opening, his hands too numb to even knock. He pushed at the woven mat. It swung inwards, and he collapsed half in and half out of the entrance into a wave of warmth so profound it felt like a physical blow. The sight before him shattered his reality. He was looking into a grotto of impossible summer. The air was warm, not with the dry, scorching heat of a stove, but a soft, humid warmth. The light came from a single oil lamp, its flame burning steadily in the still air, and it illuminated a scene of shocking domesticity. Alara sat on a raised stone platform, not bundled in furs, but wearing a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up. Her feet were bare. She was reading one of the old leather journals by the lamplight. Beside her, a small pot held a cluster of green, living herbs. In a cavity in the rock wall, a stone box glowed with an internal heat, the source of the heavenly smell. A small, perfect loaf of bread was cooling on a flat stone beside it. The gentle sound of trickling water was a soft counterpoint to the raging blizzard outside. She was not just surviving. She was thriving. She was comfortable. She was at peace. She looked up, her eyes wide, not with fear but with surprise. She saw the great master builder Silas, the man who had condemned her, collapsed in her doorway, a pathetic, ice-encrusted heap of shivering misery. He stared at her, his mind unable to process the contrast between the frozen hell he had just traversed and this sanctuary, this warm, living, breathing space. This was not a grave. It was a womb. How? The word was a cracked whisper, torn from his frozen throat. It was a question, a plea, an admission of utter defeat. Alara did not smile in triumph. She did not gloat. She simply stood up, her expression one of quiet compassion. She helped him inside, pulling his frozen bulk away from the door. She sat him down on a stone bench near the warm wall and ladled warm broth from a pot that simmered over a stone grate above a channel of hot water. The broth was thin, made from wild onions and dried mushrooms, but to Silas, it tasted like life itself. As the warmth seeped back into his limbs, bringing with it a piercing, painful tingling, he began to talk. He told her everything. About the cold, the failure of the cabins, the dwindling wood, the fear. He told her about his son. His voice broke, and the great Silas, master builder of Providence, wept in front of the orphan girl he had cast out. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I was wrong. We built our homes like forts, and they became our prisons. We sealed ourselves in tombs of ice. You listened to the mountain. You built a home." Alara listened patiently. When he was finished, she simply nodded. "Your family?" she asked. "Freezing," he croaked. "My boy. He is sick." "Then we must bring them here," she said, her voice calm and certain. And so the sanctuary became an ark. Alara, armed with her knowledge, and Silas, humbled and now fiercely loyal, ventured back out into the storm. They did not go to his house first. They went to the houses of the old, the sick, and those with young children. Silas, his authority now rooted not in pride but in desperate necessity, convinced them. He didn't have to argue. The sight of him, alive and no longer freezing, and the impossible tale he told, was enough. One by one, family by family, they made the treacherous journey to Alara's folly. They arrived, half dead and disbelieving, and were welcomed into the warmth. The small cavern filled with the huddled masses of Providence. They slept on the floor, on the platforms, anywhere there was space. They shared Alara's meager stores of bread and broth. The hot spring became a place of healing, its warm waters soothing frostbitten limbs and weary souls. The children, miraculously, saw it as a great adventure, their laughter echoing in the warm, damp air. For the first time in weeks, the people of Providence were not cold. They were crowded, they were hungry, but they were warm, they were alive, and they owed it all to the girl they had thrown away. When the great freeze finally broke, shattering its icy grip on the valley, the world had been remade. The people emerged from Alara's cave, blinking in the bright sunlight, into a landscape of devastation. Many cabins were ruined, their contents destroyed. But the community had survived. The first town council meeting after the thaw was a short one. Abernathy, his face pale and chastened, formally tore up the papers of Alara's debt. By unanimous decree, the 5 acres of worthless land, along with the 50 acres surrounding it, were deeded to her in perpetuity. Her folly had become the town's most valuable asset. Her status was inverted overnight. She was no longer the orphan, the outcast. She was the savior, the woman who had listened to the mountain, but the true transformation was yet to come. It was not enough to have survived one winter. They had to learn how to survive all of them. One day in early spring, as the valley floor turned green again, Silas came to her. He did not come as a master builder, but as an apprentice. He held his hat in his hands, his gaze deferential. "Teach us," he said simply. And so she did. She brought out Grandmother Anya's journals, the leather worn soft with use. She and Silas, an unlikely pair, sat on the rocks outside her cave home, and she translated the old country wisdom into the practical language of a builder. She taught him about thermal mass, about passive heating, about orienting a structure to welcome the sun. She taught him how to read the land, to find the warm veins of the earth. That summer, the sound of axes was replaced by the sound of shovels and picks. Led by Silas but guided by Alara, the people of Providence began to build anew. They did not build tall log cabins. They built homes like Alara's, nestled into the south-facing hillsides, their north walls buried in the insulating earth. They dug down, not up. They learned to channel the small warm springs that were common in the region, piping gentle heat through their floors. Alara's folly became the prototype. Her simple, hand-dug home was studied, measured, and replicated. The principles were adapted and improved upon. The settlement of Providence became famous, a curiosity, then a model. People traveled from miles around to see the town that had no fear of winter, the town where houses breathed with the earth. Alara never married. She never had children of her own. But the entire town became her family. She was their sage, their touchstone, the quiet center of their community. She lived out her days in her warm cave, her sanctuary, a place of pilgrimage for those seeking knowledge. Years later, an old woman with eyes that had seen the depths of winter and the heart of the mountain, she would sit by her warm pool, watching the steam rise. She would listen to the laughter of children playing in the valley, a sound no longer silenced by the coming of the cold. Her grandmother's knowledge, once forgotten, had become a legacy, written not in a dusty journal, but in the very stones of the town that had once cast her out. She had asked the earth to hold her, and in return, it had given her a home and a people to share it with.